I think one of the coolest lessons I learned in school was the idea that if you want to be original, you have to be familiar with what is conventional. If you do not understand intimately the rules of standard gameplay, you if you don't understand the rules, it's going to be very difficult for you to come up with something original. If you know what's conventional, then you know what to steer away from if you're trying to do something new. Make sense? This is an important point. It was an important point for me because it underlies a as a young college student, let's say creatively inclined, not really, but let's just go with it. There's a fantasy that a lot of young people have where they think that their creative originality is all they need in order to succeed. Well, is that their creative output is of high enough value that that alone will be enough to share with other people, and you know, to get success. All you need to do is let your creativity out because you're already so different and original and whatnot. Fucking nonsense. The creative impulse, or we'll say the creative output that all of us potentially have. Okay, no, let me. If I, I fumbled it. It's important for people like me to hear this message because it gives me reason to buckle down and learn my fundamentals. As a writer, if I want to produce something in a book that's never been produced before, that means I have to have a big familiarity with the Western canon of literature, so to speak. I have to know what Shakespeare is, what the Bible is, and what all the big names, who they are, and what they've done. And I have to understand it so then I can produce something different. So I might not want to sit down and spend 5 years understanding all this classical stuff because I'm just too creative and I want to do something new. Like, that's a mistake. You got to sit down and do your due diligence and pay your respect, really, to this huge tradition of this, creative enterprise that is way bigger and way more, has more to offer than you will ever have. So understand it, learn it, become it, and then your creativity can sit on top of it and perhaps someday produce something new. Maybe. Okay, so what kind of intro is that? In Blake Snyder's Save the Cat, we're into chapter 2. Now, this was the reason why I bought this book, chapter 2, and I'll explain to you what it is. A friend of mine bought this book before I did, showed me it, and when I saw what chapter 2 was, I totally lost my shit. What is incredibly useful, in my opinion, when someone is learning a craft of some kind, immediately what's the most important thing to have when you're learning an entire new intellectual geography, when you're thrown into a new universe, is that you have to have something like a compass or some kind of general outlines that could help give you a little bit order out of this complete ocean of chaos. To be a movie writer, to be thrown into an ocean of literally thousands of movies, where do you even begin to kind of try to shape everything in a way where you could, let's say, organize everything mentally? To understand every film on its own, as its own separate, unique kind of thing, it's just mind-boggling. Imagine if you had to sit down and learn the intricate, unique shapes and figures of 1,000 different pieces of 1,000 sculptures. Like, it's too difficult. There's too many nuances, too many details, there's not enough time, and it's overwhelming. And so what we're going to do is that we're going to take this ocean of chaos and we're going to provide a set of categories, which you could segregate huge chunks of it to make your to narrow down your analysis and to make your exploration of all this information a little less overwhelming. To literally talk about oceans, you have a body of water, but if you look at a map, you split the ocean into different oceans, right? There's the Atlantic, the Pacific, Indian, there's different seas and lakes, and giving things the names and segregating from themselves, your mind has different names and different pictures for different things, and that makes it easier to digest, and you can pick things out individually and understand them. Okay. That's what chapter 2 offers. When we talk about stories, particularly movies, this is a book about screenwriting, but it is generally about stories, but let's just narrow it down to screenwriting. We talk about genres. When you're with your friends, you talk about horror, you talk about comedies, tragedies, westerns, all this stuff. However, a different level of analysis, you could, instead of looking at the genre, which you could look at as like a color, you instead look at the story, the plot, the series of problems that happen, the kind of hero that you're dealing with, and the nature of those problems and the way that the hero overcomes those problems. And you'll find that there are repeated patterns of plot structures that you could categorize large swaths of film under. And having those categories at your disposal, like food groups, meats, veggies, fruits, again, segregates the large ocean of information and makes it much easier to appreciate and work with. So Blake Snyder, first off, he's making a very, very bold claim, which, a lot of people have issue with. Now, I don't mean professionals. I just mean like new people that are learning about stories for the first time. And I really hate that response. I kind of like it when people are open and they just humor an idea, So, sorry, that was something else. Blake makes a bold claim saying that, and again, I'm a Sith Lord. I talk in absolutes. I don't. Every single film that exists, again, I know there's some exceptions, but okay, mainstream films, thousands and thousands of films, okay, all of them, every single one falls under one of 10 different film categories, and I'm not talking about genre. There are 10, according to Blake Snyder, in this book. I'm sure there are other authors that cut things up a little bit uniquely, but in Blake Snyder, he gives 10 different unique plot structure shapes under which every single film could be coherently labeled as an example of. Just like any single food that you pick, no matter what it is, can be thrown into one of the 5 or 6 food groups, no matter what it is. Right? There's no food that doesn't, except like mushroom. Is mushroom a vegetable? No, it's a fungus. Is it technically a vegetable? I don't understand. But you get what I'm saying. That was a 10-minute intro. I haven't even talked about any of the categories yet. So, in this video, let's do the first 2, and then in the subsequent video, we'll see how far we get. He says this, and again, the reason why it's important, the argument that Mr. Snyder is making, every single serious writer ought to take categories like these extremely seriously, because you'll find, as we'll read the chapter, every single story structure, every single unique model, let's say, story structure, is a kind of unique game. And every single structure has its own rules, okay? Has its own rules. But also, every single story has opportunities. Or rather, there are certain reoccurring corners or components that are in every single version of that category, that you as a writer could come up with a unique way to instantiate it. Let's use one or two examples here to illustrate what I'm talking about, or what Mr. Snyder is talking about. Oops, wrong chapter. Okay, so he begins the 10 categories with a very, very simple category. And every category he gives a very unique name to it. It's like every single one has a phrase. Okay, the first one that he talks about is called Monster in the House. Monster in the House. Think about that phrase for a second. Monster in the House. And no, it does not necessarily mean that a film under this category is a horror film. Although horror films find an easy time, this category has within it a lot of horror film, because horror film is very easy. It very easily lends itself to this category, but you can twist it and make it a comedy. That's kind of an example as you as a writer can take a category and use it in a creative way. Okay, but that's getting a little bit too far ahead. Now, so he starts off the chapter by naming 3 films: Jaws, The Exorcist, and Alien. Okay, what do those 3 films have in common? The Exorcist, Jaws, and Alien. All 3 of them are kind of horror films. But he says that all of them are examples of a genre that he calls Monster in the House. Let's see. Let's see. So, let's just jump straight into the rules. Well, no, there's this little line here. He says, this genre has a long track record. He calls it genre. Don't get it confused with the way normal people talk about genre. But he says this genre has a long track record and was probably the first tale man ever told. It has 2 working parts, okay, a monster and a house. And when you add people into the house desperate to kill the monster, you've got a movie type so primal that it translates to everyone. It's a type of movie that I like to say you can pitch to a caveman. Not because everybody understands the simple primal commandment of do not get eaten. Monster is chasing you, avoid the monster. Again, he'll give you an example of how that might not necessarily be a horror film. But okay, let's get to the rules of the game. We have a board game in front of us, and it's called Monster in the House. Okay, how do you play? This is it. He says, the rules to me, this is Snyder talking, are simple. The house, okay, must be a confined space. A confined space. So not necessarily a house. It could be, he said, his examples are a beach town, Jaws, a spaceship, Alien, a futuristic amusement park, Jurassic Park. So I would say like a giant circus tent, maybe a bunker underground like Cloverfield Lane. Maybe it could be, what's another confined space? Well, a prison, maybe a confined space. Anyways, a confined space. Okay, that's number 1. Number 2, and this is a really interesting one, okay? He says, there must be a sin committed by one of the characters. Usually greed, he says. Monetary or carnal, whatever that means. Prompting the creation of a supernatural monster that comes like an avenging angel to kill those who have committed the sin. So let's think about that. Okay, the image that comes to me easily is Jurassic Park. You have scientists who, to quote Jeff Goldblum, I think he said they're playing God, bringing back to life these extinct animals for our amusement and for study. So the sin is kind of, what is it, like transgressing, the sphere of activities that are within our rights to do, where we're going beyond what is good and playing God. And so through that creation, what we create brings out more destruction than we had anticipated. Okay, so that's like a sin that you commit out of greed or curiosity or whatever that bites you in the ass. Okay, it's pretty simple, right? But what's another example? If you can think of other examples, go ahead and leave it in the comments below. We can pitch ideas to each other, which I think is totally lots of fun. Okay. So a sin must be committed. Another example that popped in my head is Frankenstein, right? Someone who wants to create. But is that monster in the house? I don't think so. But anyways, okay. To kill those who committed the sin and spare those who realize what the sin is. The rest of the movie is run and hide. So let's go back to the three examples he used. Okay, The Exorcist, which in my opinion is not as great a movie as the legacy of the film is more about it being a milestone maybe in horror film. But as a film in its own, I don't think it aged very well. I recently watched it and I kind of was not very... Anyways, the spirit or the demon that possessed that little girl comes about, I think, because the little girl plays a Ouija board by herself. I remember the scene was really brief that it even mentioned that, but right, I guess that would be an example of a sin. I don't know if it's greed or something like that, so I don't know if that would be a good example of it, but nonetheless, you have a character that does something wrong, that wrong act is what ushers in a demon or a monster or something through which that monster... Okay, I'm beating a dead horse, but you get it. Okay. And then, okay, here comes... Okay, but the rest is run and hide, okay? Now, here comes the interesting part. And putting a new twist on both the monster's powers, and the way we say boo is the job of the screenwriter who wants to come up with something new. Now he gives an example of a terrible film that a terrible monster in the, or a movie that is terrible, that is a monster in the house film that is terrible because it broke the rules. Now this is really interesting because Blake is kind of implying here that there is a connection between a quality of a film and how well it colors within the lines of these rules. Now, how far you can push that theoretically is really interesting. You know, great films are great because they kind of play within certain boundaries or within certain rules, okay? Whether or not we understand or know all the rules is not clear, but if you can understand and know the rules and know why something is good, that's a great asset for you as a writer. And so, therefore, if you ever encounter a terrible film, it behooves you to sit down and analyze it and ask yourself, why does this suck? Or another way to ask it is, what rule is this story violating? Because it's underlining a rule, which if you can understand, if you can extract out of it, you can understand it, and then you can add it to your arsenal of what's important in a film. Endlessly useful. That's why I think this kind of stuff is interesting, because it gives you reason to watch shitty films. Or, you know. Anyways. Okay. So Blake is saying that although Monster in the House as a genre is a very old film, we'll call it story shape. I like to think of them as like constellations in the sky. There's 10 of them, 10, 12 zodiacs. I kind of like to think of it like that. Although this is a really, really old story form, and it's taken on many forms, Blake Snyder is telling all writers out there that this story form is not at all exhausted. There's plenty of creative room to invent new ways to go about telling this story. And he gives a good example. He says, there is always a way to do a new one. You must give it a fresh twist to be successful. You must break the cliche. You must give us the same thing, only different. Anyone who thinks there is no new territory to mine in the Monster in the House genre should think of the myth of the Minotaur. Minotaur is an old Greek myth of this underground labyrinth where there was this Minotaur, this half man, half thing, horse or something, where people who would be thrown in the maze, and they would have to deal with this Minotaur that's in there that's chasing them and trying to kill them. That's a pretty good Monster in the House fucking right? He says that myth of the Minotaur in the maze, I think is a maze made by Icarus's father. I haven't read Greek myth in a long time. A half man, half bull. Excuse me, it's a half bull. It's a great house, he says. It's a maze where the condemned are sent to die. But the ancient... Oh, okay. He mentions another film with Glenn Close. I think it's called Monster-in-Law. It's the story of a son-in-law who's getting married to the daughter of Glenn Close, and the movie is him having to deal with her for like a weekend or something. So it's a kind of comedic twist on Monster in the House, where the monster is not something that's trying to kill you, but it's a mother-in-law who's making your life hell. It's a pretty interesting way to give it a fresh twist. Okay, you know, there's probably an endless number of ways that you can do it, and if you understand the genre very well, you could take one component and ask yourself how to flip it, how to do something else, how to make it comedic or whatever. And so I think that's enough. We hit 21 minutes. I think we covered a lot. Any comments, questions, or concerns, or anything you want to say, go ahead and leave it in the comments below. That was Monster in the House. There's a house, there's a monster, there's this sin committed that brings about an angel of revenge that kills those who committed the sin and spares those who that does not. And our jobs of the writer is trying to find new ways to new monsters with new powers and new ways that we can say boo. And that includes taking this form and giving it a comedic version, or a, who knows, even a romantic version. You try to take odd things that don't go together and come up with a way that is that's the birth of creativity, to my mind. So that's what makes these things really useful. So if you liked this stuff, I recommend getting the book and subscribing, because I'm going to go over all of them one by one, and we'll probably have a lot to talk about. All right, thanks for tuning in, thanks for hanging out, and see you in the next video, guys. Bye.